Russian President Vladimir Putin is on defense this morning. During a meeting with his top officials, Putin vowed a strong response to the Ukrainian ground operation into Russia's Kursk region. There's new video also out this morning of what is happening there and what's happened. A warning, the video you're about to see is graphic. It's video from a Russian soldier's body camera. And as he's walking, showing a trail of dead bodies near the Kursk border with Ukraine. Joining me now is CNN military analyst, retired U.S. Army Major General Spider Marks. It's good to see you, Spider. Thanks for being here. So 2 years into this stalemate, this is a new tactic for Ukraine. Ukraine's own forces marching miles across the border in this surprise operation. And it's been going on for a week now. What do you think of this as a tactic, and what do you think they've accomplished?
Okay, what you're really seeing right now is a capability that the Ukrainians have demonstrated in the past, but on Ukrainian soil. Look, they did some significant flanking operations and tactical engagements in the vicinity of Kharkiv and have made that battle, where the Russians have just, again, fallen on their face, a great success for Ukraine. So what Ukraine now is doing is taking a page from that experience and linking it into a greater operation into Russia. Now, the difficulty with that is that if those operations, both in Kharkiv by the Ukrainians and now this Ukrainian flanking operation in the vicinity of Kursk, are not connected in some way, if there's a gap, that's a gap that can be exploited by the Russians. But let's be frank, the Russians have demonstrated zero capacity to detect those kinds of openings and then to exploit them. They haven't been able to do that. So I would say what we're seeing right now, tremendous success on the part of the Ukrainians. What remains to be seen is whether they intend to remain, to build up, to pour more forces in, if they think they can take forces from elsewhere and reinforce this success, or if this is simply an opportunity to demonstrate the vulnerability and the inability of the Russian forces.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you, Claire Sebastian pointed out earlier that this is the first time that a foreign power has held any part of Russian territory since the Second World War. Can Ukraine convert this into what you said, building off of? But I'm also wondering, convert it into pushing Russian forces out of Ukraine. I mean, how do they build off of this successfully?
Yeah, that's the exact point. The advantage of this operation has to be tied. There have to have been a calculation that this operation will do more than just simply bolster the morale of the Ukrainian forces and the Ukrainian people, which it certainly is. But there has to be a connection between this operation and success elsewhere. You don't want to put yourself at increased risk where you're engaged with Russian forces. And again, Kate, the Russians have been able to pour young men into this fight with a level of certainty that they're not going to do well, but the law of large numbers gives them that advantage. So if the Russians continue to do that and revert back to the way of Russian war, which is just to continue to lob artillery at infrastructure, irrespective of the tactical conditions on the ground, that's going to be very difficult for Ukraine to sustain this operation and make sure it's tied in. I mean, that's what we're seeing right now. I would imagine that the Ukrainians are going to take advantage of this, watch the Russian forces try to reinforce in some way, which, as I've said, up to date have not been able to do that. And if they can start to build, Russian forces can begin to threaten that flank of the Ukrainian forces, then they can do a retreat back into Ukraine. I would expect that might happen because Ukraine is going to reach a culminating point. All operations like this culminate. You run out of drones, you run out of fuel, you run out of ammunition. Those kinds of legitimate considerations have to be brought to the surface and addressed.
Yeah, so interesting. And just in kind of to your point, Putin's response is promising, warning, threatening of a strong response to this operation, and what that exactly means, we will see. It's good to see you, Spider. Thank you so much.
Russian President Vladimir Putin threatening to kick the enemy out after Ukraine's surprise movement into Russian territory. Ukraine claiming to be in control of hundreds of square miles of Russian territory. Russia now evacuating some 180,000 people from the area. These new offensive efforts have been described by Putin as just a negotiating tactic for Ukraine. But Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky sees it as a way to try to force Russia to make peace.
It is only fair to destroy Russian terrorists where they are, where they launch their strikes from. Russian military airfields, Russian logistics. We see how useful this can be for bringing peace closer. Russia must be forced into peace if Putin wants to continue waging war so badly.
So here to discuss more about this incursion is CNN correspondent Claire Sebastian, who joins us now live from London. Claire, good morning. These offensive efforts are the first time that we have seen Ukraine pass into Russian territory. The Kremlin has vowed a strong response. What do we think that's going to look like?
Yeah, we have to be a little bit cautious with those kinds of threats, Casey. The Kremlin is constantly threatening revenge, somewhat perhaps ironic given that they are the aggressor in this war to begin with. But we are watching out for a response. We have seen drone attacks, overnight drone attacks last night. There were even some 38 drones launched at Ukraine, according to Ukraine's Air Force. And of course, there was a fire this week at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, which is much more unusual, of course, than those drone attacks. We don't know the cause. The International Atomic Energy Agency says it still hasn't determined it, but that certainly is worth watching as we watch out for a response. But for now, we really see President Putin in damage control mode. He met on Monday with his top officials and the heads of the regions affected by this. We see him blaming the West, threatening revenge, but we also see him trying to gloss over just how bad this is. I want to play you a little clip from that meeting that really shows this. Take a look.
Today, the enemy controls 28 population centers. The depth of its penetration into the Kursk region is 12 kilometers. The length of the front is 40 kilometers.
Listen, Alexei Borisovich, this is something you report to military agencies. What the width and depth is, you tell us about the social economic situation and aid for the people.
So that was President Putin interrupting the acting head of the Kursk region, where, of course, this is all happening, as he tried to explain just how bad this is, how much of his territory is under Ukrainian occupation, and refocusing him on the social and economic element of this. You can see how awkward this is. We're now a week in. Ukraine is occupying, it says, some 1,000 kilometers of Russian territory. The first time that a foreign power, by the way, has occupied part of Russia since the Second World War.
Claire, really interesting that you play that and really highlights kind of the politics that Putin is dealing with internally. This, of course, obviously is something that has significant political repercussions here in the U.S. Obviously, Zelensky is relying very much on money that's coming from the U.S. government, money, arms, et cetera. Here was how Lindsey Graham was talking about this. He, of course, a Republican senator who's been a strong supporter of Ukraine Watch.
What I think about Kursk, bold, brilliant, beautiful. Keep it up. Putin started this, kick his ass. Bottom line is to the administration, I appreciate your support. Let these people fight. Give them weapons they need to win a war they can't afford to lose.
Really kind of interesting semiotics there. Claire, what does this mean for Zelensky on the world stage, considering he is relying so much on the support, the political support of Western allies?
Yeah, Casey, it is really interesting. I think this is part of the balancing act that Ukraine is engaged in here. On the one hand, of course, its partners, and in particular the US, have invested tens of billions of dollars so that they can win this war. And of course, they want to see them do that, and have in the past been, praising highly the ingenuity that Ukrainian forces have shown, which we now see again in this action in the Kursk region across the Russian border. But of course, there's a difference, right, between seeing, and we do see evidence of, for example, US-made Bradley armored vehicles on the ground, rumbling across the countryside of Kursk. There's a difference between that and seeing, missiles made in the US and European countries hitting Russian cities. Ukraine is still calling for more restrictions to be lifted on using Western long-range missiles inside of Russia, but they are still waiting on that. And I think that is part of the picture here. There are still red lines for Ukraine's allies.
All right, Claire Sebastian for us this morning. Claire, very grateful to have you. Thank you so much.